Carol T. Kulik is a research professor of human resource management at the University of South Australia Business School and a senior researcher within the Center for Workplace Excellence. This last part of her title is particularly appropriate because in my mind, Carol is the embodiment of excellence. Having over 90 published articles to understand how human resource interventions influence how fairly people are treated at work and improve the status of underrepresented individuals, her research and her impact on our field from a research standpoint is truly excellent. Carol's research also has important policy implications and practice implications as well, and she works tirelessly to help organizations improve the treatment of their employees, to improve their functioning, and really to have a more positive impact on society. So in that way, Carol's impact on organizations and on society is truly excellent. Carol is also a fellow of the Academy of Management. She served as associate editor of Academy of Management Journal. She served for 3 years as a rep at large for the OB division and she did the 5-year division chair track for the OB division. And for the last 4 years have served on the Board of Governors as the conference PDW chair, the program chair, and president chair-elect, and as this year as president. I remember my first year as a doctoral student reading this one article, Understanding Gender Differences in Distributive and Procedural Justice. And I thought, I aspired to this level of excellence. And so at that time, I, of course, had no idea that I would have the distinct honor today to introduce her as president of the Academy of Management. So please join me in welcoming for her presidential address, Dr. Carol T. Kulik.
So this is the 79th annual meeting of the Academy of Management. And you know, the Academy has such a long and distinguished history that I really wanted to begin my presentation in a very traditional way. Once upon a time. Once upon a time, there was a group of management scholars, and they lived in an ivory tower. They spent a lot of time thinking great thoughts. And every once in a while, they'd have an especially exciting thought. And when that would happen, they wanted to share that thought with end users. But alas, their thoughts were not relevant to the end users. And so the scholars' work had very little impact. Now, I told you a fairy tale, and we all know fairy tales are false. But a funny thing about fairy tales, they often have this tiny grain of truth. What I really like about this fairy tale, with that ivory tower image, is that it makes the interface between academics and those mysterious end users very vivid. And you know how much I love interfaces. Now, my use of the term end user might have surprised you. You might have been more comfortable if I had said managers or practitioners or stakeholders, but I chose end user very deliberately because of the different definitions that are attached to it. Here's one set of definitions. Wikipedia tells me that we first saw the term end user coming into popular usage in the 1980s. If you remember, that's when we first saw personal computers coming onto the market. It was the first time that we saw computers being targeted to individual users, as opposed to organizations or computer professionals. So many of these distinctions, many of these definitions, draw a distinction between the person who actually uses the product and the person who has designed or created or installed the product. Now, the 1980s also marked my first experiences within this academy, way back when I was in graduate school. My dissertation advisor and his advisor before him had the specific view that people should not just be productive at work, but also satisfied and motivated. Now, back in the 1980s, I might not have used the exact term, but if you had asked me to picture an end user, I would have pictured something like this. I would have thought of people in low-level jobs who were badly managed and not very engaged in their work. And I can honestly say that at this early part of my career, when I was in graduate school and starting my first academic job, questions about relevance and impact never kept me up at night. Over their lifetime, people spend 90,000 hours at work. So I thought, what could be more relevant than designing jobs that were good for organizations and good for people? So when I would come to academy meetings and I'd listen to presidential addresses like you're listening to today, the messages that really resonated with me were always about translation. If we can go back to my fairy tale for a minute, I thought if the work that we're doing is relevant, and I knew it was, we just needed to find better ways to communicate. We needed to design better paper airplanes that would actually cross the interface. So, you know, I've spent an awful lot of my academic career trying to translate. I've learned to write blogs. I got a Twitter account, even though Quinetta had to help me learn to use it just the other day. I did radio and magazine interviews. I threw lots and lots of paper airplanes. But let's think about who was catching them on the other side. Now, the first set of end-user definitions I showed you made this distinction between the consumer and a producer. But here's another definition. This one distinguishes the person who uses a product from the person or organization who purchased that product. I really like this definition. I really like it because it reminds me that end users all have their own individual goals. They might ignore products that their organization has purchased for them. They may use products that their organizations purchased for them in wildly different ways than their organization expected. Now, since I've left graduate school, I've worked in 5 universities in 2 countries. And in my day-to-day academic roles, I most often interact with end users who either are frontline managers or who aspire to become frontline managers. They're the people who come to practitioner conferences. They're the people who attend our university lectures. But most often, they're the students who enroll in our MBA courses. Honestly, these are pretty small fish. They don't have a lot of status in their organizations, but they do have enormous impact and influence on the people who report to them, or those people who might report to them in the future. And what they lack in organizational status, they make up for in numbers. There's tons of these frontline managers. They are legion. And they're not going to be frontline managers forever. Some of them go on to become the really big bosses. Some of them go on to be company owners. And honestly, when I think about end users this way, I believe that we, as management scholars, can change the world. We just got to do it one manager at a time, one workplace at a time. But it can be done. Because when I talk with these end users about work design or gender equity or sustainability, they see the relevance for sure. They're receptive. They want to be a force for good. They're there. They're ready to catch my paper airplanes. But there's this disconnect. Our profession craves impact. And like most academic researchers, I've been internalizing a lot of impact messages over the course of my career. So now my research focuses on the big causal factors, the ones that will suggest real solutions and produce organization-level changes. In other words, I've really been trying to think big, been trying to get those big thoughts out there. And I think that's so characteristic of our field. Today, our theories are more sophisticated, our data sets are bigger, and our models are multi-level. We know so much more about complicated organizational phenomena today than we did back in the 1980s. But here's the irony. Those big factors that would produce real change in organizations are exactly the ones that my end users can't influence. The content's relevant, but it's pretty hard to implement. Let me show you what I mean. Question: what's the single factor that makes the biggest difference in gender equity in organizations? Answer: it's the CEO's commitment to inclusion. But my end users, they got the CEO they got. Not much they can do about it. Question: what's the fastest way to increase gender diversity in an organization's leadership? Answer: hire women directly into senior positions rather than trying to mentor them from the bottom and push them up through the organizational pipeline. But my end users don't control hiring at those senior levels. Question: what's the most direct route to closing the gender pay gap? Answer: pay transparency that makes pay gaps visible throughout the organization. But my end users don't control the pay policies in their organizations. Now, these examples come from my own research on diversity and inclusion, but the disconnect is even more visible when I talk with end users about other people's management research. Honestly, when I talk with end users about your research, I can translate it, I can show the relevance of it, but I can't always transform it into a tool that I can put into my end users' hands. So I've been thinking a bit, what can we do about it? So of course, you know, most of the reading I do is in our beloved Academy of Management journals. But when I'm not reading those journals, I love reading hacks. I love reading tips about how I can lead a better life by making just little changes. So for example, things like park your car in the furthest corner of the parking lot so you get this extra exercise during the day. Or things like organize your clothes the night before so that in the morning you have a few minutes to meditate before you go to work. Or keep cut up veggies in the fridge so you won't automatically reach for the chocolate bar when you're hungry. I read these straightforward tips, these very specific things, and I think, I can do that. I can be a better person. So I was thinking that our end users need research-based hacks. Wouldn't it be great if at the same time that we were thinking these big thoughts about how to create big impact, we also tried to think small and gave every end user something that they could implement tomorrow? So for example, I could tell my end users that they should ask their employees what kind of flexibility they need instead of just waiting for employees to come and negotiate flexibility. Or I could tell my end users that when they're hiring, they should tell their recruitment firms that they want 2 women on every shortlist. And if their recruitment firms can't deliver that, find a new recruitment firm. Or I could tell my end users to ask their HR unit if they've done a pay audit. And if HR says they haven't, volunteer to crunch the numbers for them. And so I challenge you. In your own research program, yes, please continue thinking big. That's really important. But could you also think small? What if, in the next paper you wrote, when you described the practical implications of your research, you identified one thing that an end user could do based on your research? What's the one thing that any single manager, any single employee could do tomorrow that would be the first step on positive change in their organization? You know, one of my academy colleagues asked me, why is it that the papers we write traditionally include research implications and practical implications, but not teaching implications? You know, I think that's a really good question, because the classroom is one of the places where we have the most direct access to end users. So what if, in the next paper you wrote, you explained how you'd bring this finding into the classroom? But I emphasize not to get students to understand the finding or to get students to see that the finding is relevant to organizations, but to enable them to create change in their organization. In their presidential addresses, previous Academy presidents have warned us that if we really wanted to connect with end users, we needed to find a different way of working. We needed to engage with end users right from the start. We needed to create space for end users to tell us what the critical questions are. But even if we bought into that vision, the interface was impenetrable. You know this part of the story. Academics are too comfortable in their ivory tower. Academics are too focused on rigor and jargon. And golly gee, even if academics wanted to do this, universities don't reward academics for engaging with end users. It would take dramatic system-level change to make the interface more porous. Yeah, someday we might see those changes, but I think someday is today. There's a lot of forces changing our relationship with end users, but I'm only going to highlight two interrelated ones. First, social pressures are more intense than before. Communities expect a lot from their universities. They want to be reassured that government funding is being spent wisely. So universities are increasingly asked to demonstrate impact and be accountable for impact. Now, if I say ERA, or if I say ref, and the person next to you has given a little involuntary shudder, chances are really good that they live either in Australia or in the UK. Because ERA and REF are these big national exercises designed to see if the research done in universities is delivering value. And the most recent iterations are experimenting with assessing impact. Very consciously, not academic impact measured through citation counts, but the impact on practice and the impact on the professional community. The other force is financial pressures. No matter where you live, universities are a lot more enthusiastic these days about industry dollars to fund academic research. So increasingly, if we're going to do research, we need to find the funding ourselves, and that means looking for industry sources. So what's the bottom line? I think the bottom line is that these forces are finally encouraging universities to align their priorities with those of end users. And as a result, universities are finally rewarding us as academics to align our priorities with those of end users. So here's one last definition of end users. This is one that's popular in my local context. You'll notice the change in the level. The definition mentions individuals, but it highlights our relationship with organizations, businesses, and governments. As a result, the end users my PhD students deal with are different than the end users I was reaching out to. My PhD students deal with end users not as individuals, but as organizational representatives. Their end users have access to money and other resources. They're heaps more influential than the end users I was dealing with, because these end users are the big fish. At the same time, though, my PhD students have less access to the end users I had traditionally worked with. Remember that my end users were most typically the managers-to-be coming up through traditional MBA programs. Those traditional face-to-face MBA programs may not be dead, but they're pretty seriously injured. The University of Iowa already graduated its last cohort of traditional MBAs, and my alma mater, the University of Illinois, just admitted its last cohort of traditional MBAs. You know, it makes sense for universities. They get more economic value from online courses and from specialized master's degrees than they do from those generalist MBA programs. But students in those specialized courses or in online courses don't get as much exposure to management research. So as a result, my students' relationship with end users is very different than my relationship with end users was. They're working with end users from day one, and they're designing their PhD projects with the support of end users. At my university, and I know we're not alone in this, end users sit directly on students' dissertation committees. To work with these end users, my students have to do a lot more than translate research findings. They need to know how to manage legal agreements, protect their intellectual property, and develop commercial products. So I ask myself, is this good news or bad news? And I know the answer. Of course the answer is, it's fantastic news, right? This is what we always wanted, to work with these influential end users and produce real change in organizations. And I see so many positives. My students will never bear the risk of designing a beautiful PhD thesis on paper and then be unable to negotiate organizational access. I see students designing bigger PhDs than I ever dreamed possible. I see them creating diagnostic tools with end users. I hear PhD students talking about ecosystems, where my cohort used to talk about working with individual organizations or businesses, and we thought we were having really big impact. So it's good news, really, honestly, good news. But, after decades of getting good sleep, suddenly questions about impact and relevance are keeping me up at night. I worry. Are these end users going to ask the right questions at the right time? Right now, with the hashtag #MeToo movement, I can find funding to study sexual harassment. Honestly, it's just not that hard. But as an academy, we were studying sexual harassment back in the 1980s. That means that today, when organizations are finally engaging with the issue, we have something ready to offer them. And I think, what if we had waited for organizations to ask us that question? We'd only be starting the research now, and we would be way behind the curve. I worry. Will we only study friendly end users? Aged care, banking, fast fashion, these are industries with serious management problems. But we know from past experience that the worst offenders are the least likely to open their doors to research. If we only study the organizations who want to work with us, what happens to our academic goals of generalization? We also know from past experience that good organizations don't necessarily want to give up their competitive edge. They might be happy to let us in, but they don't want to give away their trade secrets. So will our closer relationships with these end users actually pull us away from our practice goals of dissemination? I worry. Will we only study end users who can afford us? Small to medium-sized enterprises represent 95% of firms and 70% of employment in OECD countries. They are most likely to be disrupted by new technology. They're most likely to fail. So they need us more than the big firms do. But they're also the least likely to have slack resources to devote to research. And does the push for funding mean that we will primarily study end users in the private sector? Now, I remember the definition that I showed you, and I know it mentioned specifically government and community organizations. So I know that focusing on the end user doesn't have to mean private sector. but I'm a realist. And when I walk through it, I think, well, gee, the private sector is more likely to bring dollars to fund the research. And the biggest organizations in the private sector will provide more research participants. And I don't know about you, but every time I learn a new analytic method, I realize that I need bigger and bigger sample sizes. So I just think these forces are kind of pushing us so that working with big companies in the private sector may become the easiest road to take. And so in a nutshell, these end users could, over time, become a pretty privileged and elite group. And that's not good for our field. But my biggest worry of them all is this one. Will we lose sight of the ultimate end user? I keep thinking about my original end user, that individual worker who's badly managed in a low-level job. The field of management has long been criticized for studying white-collar employees in comfortable offices. If the end users that we interact with are mostly senior managers in the biggest organizations, are we going to get pushed toward their problems? And so I challenge you to display some resistant but constructive behavior in your own research, and to encourage your PhD students to do the same. Some of you here are heads of school, deans, and other kinds of administrators. I'm challenging you too, to create some space for your academics to engage in these behaviors in your local environment. I challenge you to push research questions to your end users as much as you invite research questions from your end users. If a question interests you for an academic reason but doesn't interest your end users, remind yourself that sometimes the cart should come before the horse. Let's legitimize academic bootlegging and divert a little time and a few resources for those projects that we think are important but aren't yet valued by managers. I challenge you to kick at doors that don't swing open, to find ways to study the organizations who aren't laying out the welcome mat for us. Policymakers and unions are stakeholders too, and the formal definitions of end users include them, but I worry that they may be underutilized. As an academy, we have never engaged with policy enough, and I'm delighted that the Academy of Management Perspectives has a revised mission statement that really highlights the policy implications of our research. But here's the tricky bit. Today, the organizations who implement our research outcomes are often the same organizations who fund the research activities. Isn't that interesting? You know, we're so uncomfortable with tobacco companies who fund research showing that smoking isn't bad for you. We are so uncomfortable with pharmaceutical companies who fund research showing that drugs have no negative side effects. How did it happen that we got so comfortable with employers funding research on work and employment? And how effective are we going to be in persuading policymakers to be informed by scientific research if the research is corporate-backed? In the health sciences, there's research evidence that community members view collaborations between academic and industry as producing less legitimate and less credible findings than collaborations that involve only academic contributors. So we should really remember that our engagement with one set of end users might be inadvertently negatively affecting the quality of our engagement with another set of end users. But most importantly, I challenge you to think small, to not lose sight of the worker as the ultimate end user. We may be partnering with senior staff in the organization, but the ultimate end user is still the individual worker and the individual community member. You know, in our literature, there are these pockets of researchers who are studying social justice and vulnerable populations, and they're very deliberate about bringing members of those populations into the research co-creation process. But my question is, how can we make it mainstream? What if every legal agreement between a university and an organizational end user included a very specific clause that gave the researcher direct access to low-level employees about the interventions that they were designing for managers. The 79th meeting of the Academy of Management has more than 2,000 sessions. I reckon when you leave this ballroom today, we're at about the halfway mark. What's cool about that is it leaves 1,000 opportunities to practice thinking small, to think about how we can connect our research findings with those ultimate end users. Thank you for listening, and thank you for being part of our Academy of Management community. And thank you also for this past year. It's been an honor to serve as your president, and it's also an honor now to pass the gavel to your next president. Jackie Coyle Shapiro is a professor of organizational behavior at the London School of Economics. Her 2018 program theme invited us to focus on improving lives, considering both physical and psychological well-being. Jackie inspires me to embrace that philosophy because she exercises every morning, but she also understands the value of an after-dinner ice cream. On the Board of Governors, Jackie regularly reminds us to be agile and flexible, to be like bamboo in the breeze. She's going to be an awesome Academy of Management president. Please welcome her.